Welcome to lecture 11, and we finally made it this far in the class. And what we're going to be doing for this week is looking at very briefly the whole issue of environmental policy, and look a little about the history of the development in environmental policy, particularly in the US, because globally this is still something that's been growing, and each country has its own way of looking at it. So we'll just focus on us just to keep this simple, because you can literally spend several courses just looking at environmental policy within our country and also between countries. So we're going to look at environmental policy and regulation. How do we go about making these, which involves a little about learning about the government, and then briefly touch about what is the global goal of international environmental policy, meaning where are areas that we have to cooperate and have to make unifying laws. And all of this is going to go back to a very important concept and focus on a concept called sustainability. So when you think about sustainability, this is what politicians and governments are really aiming for. This whole idea, which we'll define a little later, about making sure that policies are livable and doable, and ensure that we have from generation to generation resources, jobs, and other things that allow us to live within a certain what we identify as a lifestyle. The problem when we look at political systems is a lot of times sustainability it goes on what we call political cycles. That means politicians just plan for their years that they plan to be in term and don't always look at it from a multi-generational perspective. So again, when we look at environmental policy, we're entering a period of incredibly new challenges. And a lot of this has to do with the growth of the web, and where information now is available at such an incredible rate, and information we never knew before is out there. And also we're able to communicate globally real rapidly, and even just across the United States we have this real-time communication and real-time awareness of environmental issues. And particularly in developing countries, this has developed a whole new arena for looking at the growth of environmental policy. And this is going to go even beyond what political systems want. This is going to be looking at more of the power of the people in determining the environment they want. And this is sometimes called stakeholders ownership. That means the people that are recipients of the environmental quality, and that does include the general public, but also industries, small businesses, other sectors of the economy are all looking at their stake and trying to balance this stake for a long-term goal. And we're also aware of now the availability of resources, particularly those that are disappearing. And this is leading to now better measures to look at long-term policy making that keeps us sustainable, particularly to that 2050 era. So right now, the world is focusing on how do we make policy, how do we make rules, regulations, guidelines for how we use resources and how we treat the environment that will get us to that 2050 point where the human population is going to be at its carrying capacity. That means we're going to have no more resources to add to a burgeoning population. So how are we going to deal with this is the general global rule. Now, each individual country is working on this on their own too, and unfortunately, right now, there's not that much collaboration going on. So again, our main goal now is looking at how do we deal with past population growth, particularly in the past 50 years, and how we're going to look at the next few years of what type of resource would be available, and how do we deal with this whole idea of some of the consequences of resource use, which means loss of habitat, pollution, and other issues. So I mentioned this whole idea of globalization. So yes, ideally, globalization is going to be the key for successful environmental policy and resource use policy. And guys, today we can't avoid international trade. America imports resources that we don't have, and particularly to rate reuse resources, we have to have international cooperation. But we also have to have cooperation in a way that we're not devastating another country's resources and polluting them to the point of rebellion and exploitation. We have to look at now investments. How do we invest in our future? What's going to be the cost of having a sustainable world? Because I know in the European Union, it is hurting people right now to be environmentally friendly. And current generations don't always think about what the next 2 generations are going to have. We're more interested in our needs and not so much the needs of the future. And we're going to have to start paying more for our needs or have less use of resources to make sure that future generations have that. And unfortunately, political cycles don't always play in this way, and sometimes people don't always play in this way. So again, I mentioned earlier, this whole communication revolution has really had major changes on environmental policy. And I've been in environmental policy literally pre-internet, pre-desktop computer where we communicated through mainframes if we did. It sometimes took weeks before I got information from a colleague in the form of publications, and sometimes a year before data got out. We had very little international communication on making policies, and even politicians a lot of times didn't know what was going on with each other until they had some type of gathering like a meeting of the mayors or Senate meetings or House meetings. So it's incredible what's going on today. We can have these really quick information input, but also we are tending to make knee-jerk reactions into this. We don't have that time span now to think about how do we deal with environmental policy. So when we look at what we call kinds of policy responses, policy, particularly environmental policy, has to be sensitive to economic growth. I mean, I have to understand that the ideal world that I want as far as being environmental friendly has a cost. And it might put people out of business, it might close certain industry sectors, and I also make life inconvenient. It might affect my economic lifestyle, which, I fit kind of medium on on the nuts of resources I use. I'm not the most environmentally friendly person, but this is what, the style I live in. These are sometimes the things I need to do what I need to do. And particularly even working in environmental policies, I have to travel a lot, which pollutes. I produce a lot of paper waste. I use a lot of electronics and a lot of electricity to get my job done. So we also look at the effect of policy on the environment, because the environment is what gives us our natural resources and also keeps us healthy. We can't have poor water quality and air quality to the point where it's making us sick and it affects our society. And also social goals. We got to be very careful of things called environmental justice. That means certain people have all the gains from society and very little of the downside of it, like pollution or bad living conditions. And some people have all the bad living conditions and pollution and none of the gains from that. And we also have to be careful of how we perceive environment. We have people, the developmentalists, we learn real early, that believe that humans should use a lot of technology and exploit what we can, while others that are more biocentric, which value nature more than people. So we have to take this all into concern, and particularly when doing an international environmental policy. And this is the most difficult thing that I do when I go into another country and look at setting policy. I can't be, dictatorial about it. I can't think that they think like Americans or Europeans, and I can't make any of those assumptions that they will follow American ideology, which is what I've been basically raised with and taught to do, at least in the United States. And plus, I can't import another country's environmental ethics into us. So I can't say China wants this, India wants this, England wants this, because it's our rules that we live by here. Yes, even though it is impacting other countries. And believe me, our pollution does get exported to Europe, to Africa, and into oceans where it goes all over the place. So, so the politics is a very delicate balancing act, and you hear this in Houston all the time. Between, wow, if we do this, it's going to affect the economy, but if the economy sector grows up, it's going to affect this. So, and as urban growth occurs and spreads, and we have urban sprawl and suburbanization, it affects our social value systems too, and tends to separate people and segregate people into rich communities and poor. And we lose that whole idea of what is diversity and how do we gain from diversity. So all of these are considerations when we look at environmental policy. And unfortunately, a lot of times environmental policy is looked at as the bad person, because we're the ones that put a lot of restrictions and how can I put that, puts a lot of cost into what happens when we enforce an environmental policy. So we've seen what it's like to have life in environmental policy. This is called ancient times. And guys, people have been concerned about the environment since, recorded history. I mean, we don't know obviously what people thought pre-recorded history, and we did know that our ancestors were Slavs. They lived in their own trash, and unfortunately our primate ancestors are no better, trashing an area and moving and leaving. So we come from a history of basically settling an area, trashing it, using up the resources, and then moving on. And then hopefully those resources will grow back without our presence being there. And we've learned about primary and secondary succession. So humans are notorious for this, and certain other creatures are too. We're not the only ones that use up an environment again and tend to move on. So I remember the days of massive fish kills growing up on the New York coast, and guys, it would be stinky and disgusting and whatever, and now we have technologies that can remove some of these fish from the water, literally boat type vacuum cleaner things, but still these occur. And we've had them in Galveston with algae kills and stuff like that. So we've seen unregulated pollution and what that can do. And we've seen, air quality horrors and nightmares where tens of thousands of people died literally in no time from poor air. And this is talking about the United States and England. Developed countries have had such horrible air quality that people, thousands of people died in a day. And sometimes the air, the smog and pollution was so thick, you couldn't see your hand in front of you during noon with no cloud cover. So, and we've seen rivers set on fire, other things. I grew up near the Hudson River, which was so polluted, we had no fish alive in it. And there was just trash literally floating on it, and it smelled so bad, it was literally hard to live there. So we know what it's like, particularly at our level of technological development, to not have environmental policy. And no politician in their right mind, and no industrial person in their right mind would say that we shouldn't have policy. So guys, your book talks about how environmental policy evolved in the past. And one thing that I think is important for us to understand is that many countries and even people, ancient peoples, even based their policies on what to do about the environment in what we call a reactionary way. That means something happened and we fixed it. And we still do some of that today a little, particularly with newer technologies like cell phones and things, electronic technologies and e-waste. We never thought about what their environmental impact would be while developing. The same was true for nuclear power. We built it without the whole idea of knowing what do we do with the waste until something horrible occurs or we're stuck now with a problem we have to resolve. The goal today, and this is the goal of sustainability, is we want to do now is focus on the future and look at this whole idea of product life cycle, which we learned a little earlier, that when we start developing technology, start looking at natural resource usage, how do we look at this from the perspective of the benefits of that, the cost of it, and then the future of continuing in this way? So we really, even as a world, have changed our policies. I mean, still countries, developing countries are in the reaction mode, but we're now getting to the point where we can plan and have good enough models to plan with that we could think about the future and prevent pollution. And I'm on a couple of committees for this, particularly one called the Commercial Spaceflight Committee. So I'm sitting literally on a board of directors and the head of one committee in which I'm looking out for the impacts of environmental pollution and public health that's affected by the growth of the commercial space industry. And we're not talking about space tourism. We're talking about, guys, they're going to be eventually, Amazon's going to be putting packages on what's called a suborbital rocket type airplane thing that's going to fly literally to the closest borders of outer space for us and then be able to deliver a package in a very efficient and inexpensive way, literally from China to here in basically a day. So we're looking at an incredible sector that's going to be developing eventually in our world. So I'm not going to go too much into the structure of our government system when it comes to making policy. And I want you to read about this in your book, because this gets a little boring, a little crazy, and you really need a whole semester course on just understanding how a environmental laws and policies come to be and where they come from. But you have a three-part government, and this is what we call the bicameral part. That means we have two divisions to it, whatever. We have this, legislative branch of the government, and these are the people that, through various layers, we see environmental policies coming out of. And usually this is generated by what we call the stakeholders. I mean, stakeholders, that means the public, you, non-governmental organizations, special interest groups, political groups, all come to the legislature, the House or the Senate, which we collectively call the Congress. And, they come up with laws, they help to write the laws, they tweak the laws, and even vote on them. And basically what they're supposed to do is set the tone for the nation of balancing environmental policy to other, to societal needs or what they perceive the needs at the time. And sometimes future needs. We see laws that are aimed at the future. Then you have your executive, and this is where, not only the president sits, but all the advisory groups and all the groups like the EPA and others that report to the president. So the president sits here listening to the legislature, or I should say the executive listens to the legislature, and they also listen to groups directly. That means different organizations that were set up for the executive to have at their command. So particularly with environmental quality, we look at National Institutes of Health, which deal with public health issues, Center for Disease Control, which is a very similar thing. They look for environmental impacts of disease, and that's why they're interested in global climate change. If you ever go to their website, is that because they're finding out that global climate change does cause environmental conditions that lead more to human diseases and even to unusual locations for human diseases to occur. And then you have, of course, the EPA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, all of which the president has at their will to listen to and help the legislature tweak policies. And then there's the judiciary, which interprets the laws, okay, and figures out whether they fit in. And then they help the executive branch to make sure that laws are fair or meet what's called precedents. Okay, and so, it's a very complex picture, but usually these two groups do not come up with with laws and regulations. They're the ones that look at it from the broader picture and tweak them and adjust them, and also look at, does this one need enforcement or not? And if it does, how do we handle that? Because there could be punitive laws and other stuff like that come about. So guys, the whole idea of passing a law, particularly an environmental law or regulation, is incredible. And guys, there are differences between the terms law, regulations, and recommendations and standards. I work with a group that's developing standards. That means that we give recommendations to industry how to not pollute, and it's up to them to follow it or not. If they don't, then they don't become competitive with their colleagues, and they could actually be shamed by the public saying, oh my gosh, this company does this and does it cleaner or better. But also, standards can become the basis of legislators saying, hey, wow, look at this rule. This really keeps people safe, and I think everybody should do it. And they then vote on it to the point where the executive and judicial branch say this should be enforced, because this is meeting the needs of society, the needs of the economy, and the needs of the environment, whichever one you're emphasizing. So just this chart is kind of like, yes, a flow chart that goes through step by step. And guys, this occurs at the city level, state level, regional level, national level, and intergovernmental level sometimes, with different entities having this occur at the same time. And sometimes this goes between two different countries. We see this occurring, particularly at the United Nations, and has to deal with lots of flow charts like this. But generally, ideas occur of what would be a good law or regulation, and sometimes a recommendation that is made by a corporation or by a non-governmental agency on how to do something correctly gets put into here. And it feeds into a system that can sometimes take anywhere from months to up to 3 to 4 years for an idea to become an actual enforceable law. And this could be a slow process. In Texas, it's usually on a 2-year cycle, because your legislature meets every 2 years, so they try to get stuff pushed through, again, in this 2-year cycle. So let's look at the role of the president, because presidents vary a lot in personality and strategies and their environmental ethical systems. But usually what happens is, this is why I pay close attention to who's elected, is because they have this group called the White House staff in particular underneath them that becomes kind of like a clearinghouse for all the agencies below, And also these agencies below here, you see, report directly to the president. So there's what the president uses these organizations for is to carry out their goal, their strategy. When it comes to environmental policies, this is very important too, and this is where I paid attention during every president that comes in. I look at the environmental ethic, and then I look at who are they hiring. For example, particularly for environmental, who are they hiring to run the EPA? Is it a person that is going to fit along the current green policies, or is going to be more industry-based, is more focused on economics? Because the Environmental Protection Agency guys, they're just an agency. They don't necessarily advocate for the environment. They just make sure that, you know, people are not harmed and the environment is not unduly harmed based on current regulations. But future regulations could change. I mean, they could even drop old regulations. And this is very typical of what happens when you change the person that's in charge of that. I pay attention to the Department of Interior because that covers, again, a lot of how we make land use, particularly Department of Agriculture, and guys, the Department of Defense is very important too, because depending on the president, they go through different environmental shifts too. They benefit from being environmentally friendly and also from petrol use. And it's funny because the military currently is in the process with a group, their research branch called DARPA, of trying to get themselves to use less fuel and produce less pollution, you know, that results from war and just general combat. And their own ranks are hurting because they spend a lot of resources and lose a lot of lives producing petrol. So the less petrol we produce, or the more that we can produce domestically or in friendly, you know, nations that we're friendlier with, we have less military deaths and less military expense. So all of these entities have their own individuality, but also the heads of those are typically governed by who's the president at that time. And of course, sometimes this has to be voted on or people can protest it. But generally, you know, the president is kind of the one that picks these people. And again, based on their philosophy. And this does not directly affect environmental law, but they can provide valuable information that can coerce the president or convince the president, depending on what their goal is, to, you know, veto a legislation that's coming to the president's office or approve it. So it's a really complex picture, and I actually kind of enjoy this part of it, and I've learned to wrangle my way around who to talk to. You learn people. Lobbyists are great at working with this whole system and learning it. And guys, when we lobby, it's not a bad thing. Lobbying is a way of sometimes giving equality to people, but also can give inequality. Like, for example, lobbyists, I mean, usually the most successful lobbyists spend a lot of money. And when you're looking at a special interest group that doesn't have a lot of money, unfortunately, they don't get hurt as well as a large petrol or industrial lobbyist. But this is a system that in all the chaos seems to work. And, you know, for the good or the bad, somehow things change over time. Again, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the better. But the system does roll forward. So please read in your book about the executive branch, because the president does set the tone indirectly for how environmental law is made and whether the president passes or not what comes through them. Because if the president does their job right, they hire, you know, people to run the government entities under their jurisdiction to kind of sway the legislative branch to develop policies that meet the goal of that president, so the president's not vetoing everything. Now, when we look at the non-governmental organizations, what's their role? This is where, you know, a lot of things like lobbyists come in, action groups, things like PETA, who look at the rights of animals. We have groups like here, like the Nature Conservatory, that protect land. So all of these groups that are not EPA, not whatever, they influence executive groups like, you know, EPA, whatever. They also talk to their legislators, and, you know, hire lobbyists. So again, this is a very complex picture when we look at all the bits and pieces that fit into this. So when we look at environmental policy again, we have people that communicate to the legislators. That means the ones that formulate, scratch out these laws and try to get them passed. So there's non-governmental groups, the public, other special interest groups of types. There's government agencies can consult with the legislators. So like, you know, a Senate House committee can talk to Department of Defense. They can talk to the EPA. So understand there's a lot going into this, feeding into the system. And again, I find this very exciting, but sometimes also very frustrating. And some presidents literally just set up a situation that is so tight that we can't get environmental policies moved, and we see some that were really good being struck down. So we have some very developmental presidents, and then some very green presidents, and some that are kind of, balance both views. But most of our presidents, unfortunately, that we see work on their campaign cycle and the cycle of their parties, the dominant parties. And a lot of times we don't look at, again, what are we going to be like in 2050? We're more worried about immediate needs because people don't want to right now. We're not ready to deal with what it's going to take for a future some of us might not even be alive for. Now, sometimes I consider lobbying to be a very, very disgusting field. I consider it sometimes one of the worst jobs to have as far as ethics and whatever, but that's not necessarily true. A lot of lobbying is done for good. We have small groups that lobbying groups that protect the rights of underserved people, that protect the rights of minorities, that protect the rights of handicapped people, that protect squirrels. I mean, you name it, there's a lobbyist group out there. So it's not all big, wealthy corporations. You could even hire a lobbyist as a citizens group. You can just go out and get one if you can afford it. The problem is, when it comes to lobbying, presence is important, and the amount of what your constituents say is important. So lobbyists that represents the petrol industries, guys, they have a lot of money. They can sit down and actually go in and see the president. They could, unfortunately contribute to campaign funds, and sometimes if that gets a little sketchy, they can contribute to causes that a president likes or that a legislator likes. So there's different ways of influence, and I'm going to tell you right out, money helps, but mostly to help with presence. But guys, lobbyists, yes, they represent a lot of people, but sometimes they represent a lot of people of similar interest. What politicians really like a lot of times is to hear from non-lobbyists. Okay, not the trade industries, not the not-for-profit groups, not the scientific groups, but a lot of times the individual person. Because you are the one that votes. Lobbyists don't vote for the people. Industry and trade associations recommend who to vote for, but they don't do the voting. And sometimes they even change their attitudes over time. And they're not always party affiliated, and a person may be. So it's the individual person when they usually communicate with the legislators, with the executive branch, that have a lot of impact, because that means them on their own, a direct voter. And if there's enough individual direct voters doing something, that shows individual action. Guys, just belonging to an environmental group doesn't make you an environmentalist. And just signing a petition doesn't mean you agree. And the executive branch knows this, because they usually sometimes count these surveys as one person, even though 1,000 people may have signed it. So individuals play a big role in this too. And they can, and sometimes with enough public uprising. I don't mean uprising like rebellion. That means communicating directly through individual letter campaigns, whether it's through emails or actually direct letters, which actually politicians, believe it or not, prefer, still the old snail mail, is that this could sometimes outdo a lobbyist. And we've seen this before with a lot of regulations, like mercury regulations with air quality and other things that lobbyists were hitting heavy for. And even with the automobile industry, we've seen that their lobby is weakened due to public uprising. And of course, a lot of environmental regulations came from, and civil rights regulations came from this public uprising. That means we just became public individually with our needs and demands and what we feel is fair rules and laws. You guys, and one thing when we start dealing with environmental law too, and this is why it's very important, and there's a lot of hesitation to just knee-jerk and come and just spontaneously come out with these laws, is that environmental law and policy, unlike many other groups, are under what's called administrative law. That means as we have agencies a lot of times that carry out and enforce these laws, besides through, of course, the judicial branch, and sometimes within their own jurisdictions. So I'll never forget growing up, as an undergraduate, I worked at a federal park that was in New York City, and it was a park that was surrounded by water, and it was a little island in the middle of literally New York City. And whenever something occurred on that island that affected the environment, we had like several enforcement entities that dealt with it. And so we had the entity, the police, the park police that worked on the land, and then we had beach that just governed the beach, and then police that just governed the waterways. And then we had other federal regulations that impacted what type of animal or plant was affected. And this gets to be sticky. And sometimes people find themselves in a situation where they violated several agencies' laws and end up with multiple infractions against them. So some agents, some policies we have are not enforceable. Some are just really regulations and procedures, and some are, you break the law, you don't get sent to jail. You might, get some type of punitive action, but sometimes not. So but when we look at environmental law in particular, most of them, are what we call enforceable. And that means some agency has to take action on it, either to work with the group, to correct the situation, or to have a penalty. And again, in the EPA, when they look at evaluating laws and whether the judicial branch should come in, they look at, should we penalize this? Should we send people to jail? Should we, just charge them something, or should we just help them correct it, or tell them to not do this again and make sure that they don't do this by overseeing, the operations that it takes to not let this happen again. So again, this is very complex, and each individual law has its own individual, administrative approach to it, to how do we keep track of that law. Now, when we start looking at the big guys, the history that you need to pay attention to when we start looking at environmental science in our country is what was called the NEPA, which means the National Environmental Policy Act. And don't confuse this with the EPA. This is an actual act of Congress that led to the EPA. So this actually came from, of course, the environmental consciousness movement. It came from certain other governmental entities and a lot of non-governmental entities, and generally the public in general was frustrated with their environmental quality. And even industry came in and said, we're frustrated with environmental quality. So they proposed the NEPA, which took a lot of time to get in, right around 1969, during that very tumultuous period we had of the feminist rights, the civil rights, and all of this was going on, and it helped, and that impotence of civil rights and women's rights all led to the NEPA in action, and it also led to the passing of it. So by 1970, we officially had the Environmental Protection Agency, which at the time had basically no enforcement value. And this is something that presidents change over time. Sometimes they give Environmental Protection Agency more enforcement power and sometimes less, because you can always amend and change a law. That's the problem. It does take time, but it's not as long as sometimes proposing a law, unless something stalemates it or the public really, get up in arms about it. So NEPA is our the NEPA is our main driving force behind the EPA, and the EPA is the main entity that carries this out. And they consult to the Congress. They also consult to the president, and they consult with people and independent researchers. I've had EPA grant funds before, in which our data we collected through our students. We actually did a project in the Philippines based on this. We reported back to the EPA of our strategy and what we were doing, and that helps them in the future to deal with global environmental issues on when people are manufacturing stuff for us, or they're the recipients of our pollution. How do we deal with that? It's really kind of neat. So the EPA also works with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other executive branch agencies that look at the overall picture as how does the EPA affected by what other entities are doing, and how other entities affected by the EPA. So there is a lot of collaboration that goes on, and I'm going to sometimes say reluctant cooperation. Some branches get along better than others, and depending on who the president hires or put in charge of that branch, can make dealings between the agencies, what we call intergovernmental relationships, very difficult at times. So what does the EPA enforcement options do? That means when we give the EPA that power to enforce, they can do this in various ways depending on what the judicial branch says is appropriate or not. Because the judicial branch says what's fair. Like, guys, if you throw litter on the street, you should not go to jail for 15 years. Now, the thing is, sometimes we learn that if we give a person a warning letter, that's not enough to stop them from polluting again. So sometimes we penalize. In some states, man, one littering violation could be a $700 fine. Man, that hurts. But guys, I know people that speed all the time because they make enough money, they don't care about their speeding tickets to the point where eventually they lose their driver's license, then they are paying attention to it. So you have to set penalties with enforcement that are appropriate for the infraction and also get people thinking I shouldn't do this again. And this is always a difficult thing. Of course, lower income people, enforcement is always more impactful than wealthy people. And for individuals and small entities, it's always more impactful. So yes, it's not a fair system, but we also can come up with a graded system too. Now we can even make enforcement penalties based on the income or the national product. I mean, what that company contributes to the national product. Okay, and set accordingly. So so the enforcement can be anything, from warning letters, and we can take what are called permit actions. That means we can give you a license to operate and refuse that license to do something. So there's all sorts of things that go on right up to criminal proceedings. But guys, the EPA could even encourage governmental regulations and non-governmental regulations on an industry. And again, and we can say you have to do this, this, and this, and have certification to show that that's true or evident. And that's sometimes a preventative measure that comes under enforcement. So enforcement could allow preventative things that kind of hurt a company up front because it's costly, it can slow down production. Now, what's typical for many governments is this idea of what's called command and control philosophy. And it's kind of like a military philosophy, I remember all too well. And this is particularly good for large-scale policies where we're really trying to get a grip on, pollution, on resource usage, and we have to make sure everybody is collectively doing the same thing. So what happens is we set these broad laws and broad regulations. That means we take command of the situation, particularly in complex, large-scale situations. An environmental policy, that means usually how much pollution you can prevent, what type of harm you can produce to the environment, to a person with something, or how much resources you can use, how much fish you can collect out of the ocean, all this type of stuff. We have to make command of that situation and then provide control. That means how do we enforce and how do we make sure we deal with the winners and the losers from this policy. So again, there's a lot of complexity to this because you're not going to make everybody happy. What we have to do is somehow make everybody somewhat tolerant and not always happy, but basically know that there's going to be trade-offs. We have to deal with the clashes between competing values. We call this polarization. And again, we have to somehow give something for the winners and the losers. And sometimes, guys, the losers just fade away. If you have an industry that is so dirty, okay, they're going to be losers if they don't get it together. And I ran into this with Bangladesh, with tanneries, the people that take leather and tan leather so that it can last forever as you wear it on your body, you use it as a car seat. And they were using a very polluting method. As a matter of fact, that we used to use in the United States, which is why a lot of us stopped using tanneries in this country. And we moved it overseas because we could not control the pollution. It was very deadly. So isn't that nice? We moved it overseas. We let them do it, not us. So when I was in Bangladesh, the problem is the more polluting way of tanning leather is cheap. The chemicals are readily available. The green way to do it, which there is what we call using herbal tanning rather than what's called hexavalent chromium tanning, is that it's expensive and it's slower. And it doesn't make as good a product. So they're reluctant to do it, but there are people right now who are dying from pollution, and it was a really dirty industry. And green countries like England and the EU were saying we're not going to buy products anymore that are harming your people and harming the environment. And the United States was about to jump on board with that, but we didn't. And now those industries are seeing, man, I'm going to be a loser if I keep doing what I'm doing, and I might have to take a hit, which means I might not make as much profit on our industry. It might not grow as much, and we might also have to charge whoever's buying our product more money. So this is, and we have to deal with that too. If we want to help the rest of the world, sometimes that means setting a policy and enforcing a policy that's going to hit us, but also help other people. And then there's this concept called delayed consequences. is that we have to understand that there is no immediate fix. The Bangladesh situation was going on for 15 years before I got there. And people was trying to do something about it. Believe me, they were really trying to do something about it. It was just a very difficult thing to do. So we can see that command and control, okay, when we start taking national stands on things, this can cause problems to regions, to states, to cities, whatever, because what the nation sees might be good might disproportionately harm different parts of the country. And this is where you get states have their own environmental entities, like Texas has the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality. And we try to look at and see, do federal regulations fit with us? And if not, can we get permission to adapt our own regulations? And in some states like California, they want to go beyond the federal regulations and they want to get permission for that. So a lot of this leads to conflict. And we have some states that just hate the feds and some that just love them and some that think they're not doing enough. You know, and then here comes science. Science is kind of funny because when science into the command and the control picture, we fit in just as a kind of like almost like a silent stakeholder, because we provide data and sometimes we provide interpretation. And this has been the biggest problem with global climate change. We provide data, and we let others provide the interpretation. Nobody's used to us preparing the interpretation. And when we do, it's considered opinion. So science has a really weird role because we really don't have any lobby groups that lobby our science. A, we can't afford it, and B, it could affect our funding sometimes, because a lot of times you can't get federal funds if you lobby. So we're in a sticky situation where we kind of sit back, and sometimes we have to wait until we're called in to do something. Like EPA will sometimes they'll give out grants and stuff like that to study a problem, and sometimes they'll call for us. And sometimes we can go to the EPA and say, that's a problem, please look into it. So again, this is all a very interesting situation when we look at this whole environmental policy issue. Now, again, with international coordination, this is a nightmare. And this is why we have the UN. But guys, countries that are not part of UN, we have to still deal with what we call treaties. So treaties are just basically negotiations that we do at the usually between country level. And sometimes we also have regional treaties. Sometimes we also have tribal treaties with Native Americans that form their own little national entity, you know, within a government. And this is what Canada deals with their Native Canadians, and also South America with their indigenous Indians. And this is true in many countries throughout Asia that have indigenous populations that are racially and actually politically different than a government. So a treaty is more of sometimes a non-binding, sometimes a binding pact that we negotiate, just like, again, with this command and control situation. And sometimes we have to put we set the command, but we give the treaty recipient, you know, the control, and that doesn't always work out well. So we've seen treaties that were successful over time. That means we make a command and then other people carry it out and do the control. And this is very true of the Antarctic Treaty. We're protecting Antarctica and keeping it from being exploited. Transboundary pollution. I remember this one all too well, serving on a committee looking at transboundary truck pollution between America and Canada, because our trucks did not meet the regulations they did, but they still needed the commerce. And it led to this whole big darn nasty argument back and forth. And we actually do this with Mexico. We don't like their trucks. Their trucks are dirty as far compared to ours, you know, as far as environmental compliance goes, but we also need their products. And we don't have the money to ship our trucks into Mexico and ship them back out just to bring goods. So it's a real big mess when it comes to treaties, but also a lot of these do work out. And of course, the Montreal Protocol for reducing ozone damage, upper atmospheric ozone damage. This is what discontinued a lot of the production of aerosol spray cans and the old type of refrigerants, which made life difficult and a little expensive for a while. I mean, we still have spray cans, but they use a different type of propellant. A lot of us see a lot of the pump type things which use no propellant. And today in your air conditioning, in your houses and cars, you have to have a very special cooling agent that does not destroy ozone, which is very expensive. But also, guys, what's the expense of literally losing the ozone? That could be deadly. In Australia, I should say New Zealand and Southern Australia, have seen the consequences of that. Now, guys, one area I'm also sensitive to when we do international aspects of environmental quality, particularly when I represent a developing country. Okay, and most of the time, though, I go into the country to consult as an independent entity. Like in Bangladesh, I wasn't going to force them to abide by environmental policy. I couldn't. And it was very dangerous to do so, to be honest, at the time, particularly with the entity we were dealing with the tanneries. There was a lot of lobbying, a lot of undercurrent to that industry that made it very dangerous for anybody to even challenge the industry, including, particularly the people that lived in the areas where it was being done and the people that worked there. So in some countries, they resist environmental action, particularly those that are under control of a well-developed and rich government, because that developing country may not have the resources or even a desire or even the environmental ethic. But so again, it has to come to a compromise. And we have to be culturally sensitive to people. We have to understand that, guys, not every country could afford or even desires the quality that we want. And most people will put their marginal income well before convenience and well before a clean environment. A lot of countries have no qualms about chopping down tropical rainforests and turn it into an area to grow tomatoes. I've seen this throughout Central America, and which is why I even hate going back, because what used to be a tropical forest that I walked through is now a tomato field or a melon field. So you could have tomatoes and melons and cucumbers and all of that type of stuff, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year, rather than waiting for us to go through a seasonal cycle to grow it. I remember as a kid sometimes not having access to certain fruits and vegetables because they just weren't being grown. And that was before the days we have this massive importation. And Europe has been through this with things like bananas and coconuts and chocolate and other stuff. Is very expensive and sometimes very periodic if we don't want to buy it from another country, which some things you have to because they only grow in the tropics, whatever. But anyway, so there's going to be a lot of resistance. And we can't command another country to meet our air standards and water standards and health standards and other things. Okay, but we could make trade difficult with them and make it, give them incentives to do it, which are kind of punitive incentives, but still all the same. We could also show them that their way of doing it will make their people happier and they will have better workers and healthier workers, because a lot of their people are missing work because of occupational health issues and environmental health issues. This is a very big global problem, that our environmental health actually impacts our economy. And this is something we have to show people, that we reduce the cost of their medicine and all sorts of things, by being environmentally friendly and having enforceable environmental laws. So, like I mentioned, we are coming up with new international instruments. This whole command and take charge of a country, this whole capitalistic, imperialistic mission is not working anymore. It's just leading to rebellion. It's leading to all sorts of problems. So now we're looking at non-punitive actions anymore. We're looking at corrective actions on helping, using not so much punishment, but more or less if you don't do this, there's a consequence. But not so much making them pay, sending people to jail, doing whatever, not giving them goods like we sometimes do with a country, stop our trade, is that doesn't always work. So we're finding friendlier, more amicable ways, but also understanding it's going to take time, and also we have to provide an incentive. So again, this is becoming the growing policy, and this is something that I did in Bangladesh. I gave them, the government was actually going to penalize these people and shut down the factories and send the owners to jail and do this and that. And all it led to was mild war, some killings and strife and protests by the industry. And we're trying to find a way to clean up the mess using very inexpensive technology called phytoremediation. And this is turning out to be a big boom for the researchers that were doing that type of work and never being heard. So right now they're using the local universities, local industry people to work together and clean up the environment so they can still do their business, and also slowly then look for greener ways of making the leather. But right now, if they can do it with using the toxic chemicals they're using now, but neutralize or remove those toxic chemicals, keeping them out of the environment and out of the people's bodies, that's a boom. So we're slowly growing towards more rational models as we go along. And models that we've learned in the past don't work, we're likely finally dropping them. So at one time we felt if there was a penalty and it wasn't working, you just made it more strict. And you made it stricter. And then you got meaner with your penalties. Now we're learning to be more proactive and to be more of a helper rather than just a critic. So again, one of the new international instruments for global, environmental protection and natural resource protection is something called green consumerism. And this is where education comes in. By educating the public about their ecological footprints, what are they doing? We can start getting people more aware of, this whole idea of what's called environmental consumerism. That means, can we change our way of doing things, change our consumer ethics to the point where we use less natural resources and produce less pollution without too much affecting the quality of life and the economics of life? And I do a little of this with a group called Population Connection. I do workshops for them for materials they develop that teach kids and teachers and the public, about not so much, oh my gosh, you got to control population, you got to stop being a slob, you got to stop doing this. We gently remind them that, guys, this is how you live, and what's the consequences of it? And if population keeps increasing, what's going to happen? And we're not telling them that population can't increase. We said if population is going to increase, we have to do this, this, or this, and mathematically show them the outcome, which is not always fun because most people hate math. And I found that out real quickly doing those workshops, as most people give me the thumbs down when we're doing the math and go, oh my gosh, this is horrible, a miserable workshop. Once we see the data, then it's clear. But I want them to see that the data is not, made up, and that it's real data that, you can calculate. And I haven't done that with you people really too much, except with some of the larger case studies we did. So, and one incentive too we can do with people is we can eco-label stuff, just like we label foods organic and whatever. We can eco-label to say that this material is made in such a way that it promotes sustainability, that this is contributing to the future. And that's not a penalty. It's a penalty in a way for the companies that don't have that. Because if a consumer starts leading towards this, if we make consumers more green, they're going to buy these eco-label things, and that's going to send a message to other companies, you got to start operating that way. And this is the whole idea of incentives, not punishment. But yes, an incentive can in a way be a punishment. And some companies have gone out of business because they couldn't meet the eco-label standard. And unfortunately, this is very true a lot of small companies, small businesses. So, sustainability means that we have to live today so that the next hundreds of generations can live with the same quality of life we do. But that's kind of a lie in a way. Because, and you're going to have to crank down your life a little because of the whole nature of our ecological footprints right now. We use at least 100 times more resources, literally, than the average person in a developing nation. We use 100 times more resources a day. That means a minute. Electricity, water, whatever, than a person in an average developing country. And we use about 2 to 3 times more than the average European. Canadians and us are neck and neck. Matter of fact, Canadians use a little more resource than us, mostly because a lot of it goes into heating and electricity because they need it. We don't. Overall average temperature of the United States, they need it. But still, so sustainability, it's a wonderful target on paperwork, but is it achievable? And you're going to follow a TED talk on this. I want you to watch a TED talk on it, and you're going to give a Flipgrid response to this, because I think it's very important that you understand the criticisms of sustainability. I tend to feel like sustainability is important, right down to little things, and I like this, loitering, $10 million fine. That's kind of a steep regulation, but if it was important enough, people are not going to do it. But sustainability means that we need to live, again, for future generations. But that means that even future generations have to take a hit. The problem with our generation is we're living in a certain quality that we don't want to give up. Unless your quality really, your standard of living sucks and you want to kind of move up. But even then, you want to move up. But who am I to say that people have to drop what they're doing? And even for me, and I do take hits in order to live more sustainably. Not as much as I probably should. But again, this is going to be a generational thing we're going to see. So on that note, this is it for the formal lectures. Yay! And I'm going to give you a couple of assignments to look at today. And if you have any questions, email me or leave me a mystical voicemail, which I will probably return emails much faster than voicemails. Thank you.